Well, hello and welcome everybody to the first Young Americans for Liberty and GAC, the Gettysburg Anarcho-capitalist collective debate. We're very excited to have you all here. If everyone that is debating today could introduce themselves and what side they're on.
Okay. I'm Vishal Bajpai. I'm debating with GAC, so anti-capitalist.
I'm Ian Hewitt, also with the GAC.
I'm Colin Weimer. I'm with Young Americans for Liberty.
David Thompson, pro-capitalist.
Awesome. So we're going to start open with 3-minute openings, and I believe the Gettysburg Anarcho-capitalist will be starting first.
No,
y'all will.
Okay, well, y'all go first.
After the openings, then y'all will begin with a 3-minute body, followed by a cross-examination by GAC.
Pretty sure you're reading that wrong. It's 3-minute y'all, then 3-minute GAC open.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then the bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the reverse will occur, and then we will go through the same thing one more time, followed by a 2:30 refutation.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, friends, professor, anti-capitalists. Welcome. My name, again, is Colin Weimer. This is Dave Thompson. Today we're here representing Young Americans for Liberty, or YAL, and we'll be arguing from an anarcho-capitalist perspective. Like our opponents, I don't know, and the anti-capitalist collective, we are against the state, all forms of the state, and government. Our stance stems from two aspects, a moral aspect and an economic one. Our discourse on morality stems from a single belief, and that is in an axiom known as the non-aggression principle, or the NAP for short. And the NAP is essentially an axiom that states that every person owns his or her own body and the products of labor that come from this. Labor is, of course, defined as the efforts that a human uses to change their environment into something useful. Any coercive act violating the NAP is thus unjust. The concept of property necessarily arises from the exclusive claim that every individual has over their own body, the products of labor, and any other objects they've obtained through voluntary trade. So that's what we're all about, essentially, is voluntary exchange. We love it. It's the root of our way of thinking. And it turns out when you have this on a massive scale, you have capitalism, or what we know as capitalism. I know a lot of us, we all grow up in this system, and we are told that it's capitalism, but this is in fact a distortion of the truth, and is actually more aptly called corporatism, which is a state in which government intervenes in the market and basically gives monopoly power to corporations. And we all know how much of a foot corporations have in the government. We're also rooted in Austrian economics. The school of thought has well explained the benefits of capitalism to the advancement of society and the uplifting of populations to a higher standard of living. There are some philosophies that, despite the positive effects of capitalism, see any lack of egalitarianism as justification for straying from the NAP. While they intend to bring about an equal wealth to all people, this destroys the benefits that can only arise from a system which promotes completely voluntary exchange. These benefits include the incentive for innovation, incentive to be productive altogether, and the fostering of mutually beneficial relationships, and the ability of self-sovereignty. Thank you.
And now the anti-capitalist.
All right, so to start off, we would like to thank everyone for being here today, especially y'all, and to everyone who helped us prepare for tonight's debate. Without all of you guys, this would be impossible. Now, before we get to the fun parts of our debate here tonight, we need to go over a couple of definitions. The first is capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system where the means of production are privately owned and operated for private profit. GAC is here today to argue that this economic system is inherently exploitive and violent towards a vast majority of the population. We are strongly against private property, where private property is defined as the means of production, and we're against absentee ownership, which means owning something which you are not routinely and personally using. This is very different from personal property, which is stuff you do routinely use. These things are ownable, but only by the people who are using them, and only for as long as they are routinely using them. We are here to defend the traditionally anarchist position that opposes all hierarchies, including one imposed by capitalism. Capitalism ignores basic human needs in its conceptualization of freedom. People are said to be free to choose who employs them, but they must choose an employer. In a world where the means of production, and this includes fertile farmland, are under private ownership, there are few alternatives to wage labor. The most common alternatives are starvation and homelessness. Thus, capitalism takes advantage of vital human necessities and by privatizing them, coerces the working class into wage labor. This is not freedom. It is the illusion of choice backed up by systemic violence. As some of you know, today is Earth Day. It is the one day in the year we mark out to concern ourselves with our home. The reason we need to make this an annual tradition, however, is because in a capitalist system we are rarely concerned with things such as the long-term health of our planet. Capitalist timelines are short. We want to see profits every quarter. We would like to see growth every year. This quest for endless growth on a finite planet is unsustainable, and the Earth's deterioration operates on a larger timescale than quarterly profit reports. This short-sightedness is exacerbated by the fact that the harm is uneven. The people who gain the most from industrial production do not have to face with the impacts of industrial pollution. Large-scale impacts like global warmings impacting small island countries with no factories before other countries, and the dumping of radioactive waste into waters of undeveloped countries are commonplace and easy to see. Harder to see, but just as insidious, is the fact that trash incineration plants tend to be located closer to poorer communities and away from wealthier communities, which actually produce most of the trash. To solve these issues, we need to allow for communities to manage their resources themselves. Communities are the best to decide how their resources are organized because they will face the consequences of those decisions. Currently, the owners of capital, even if they live thousands of miles away, can tell communities what to do. This is the source of the externality issue.
And now y'all can open the body of their argument.
His first response would be to point to where the idea of property comes from. And since the main, I guess, difference between our two systems talks about the means of production, which are the non-human aspects that produce, which can be used to create consumers' goods, which then we use to get the things that satisfy our wants and needs. And we also have to look at the idea of coercion. Now, one of the first ideas set by GAC is that there is inherent exploitivity and violence in claiming ownership over a means of production. Although this, to us, seems pretty arbitrary, specifically because there's not anything inherently special in a means of production that gives it some sort of moral entity outside of any other object that can be owned. For example, I may own a seed which I could use to plant a tree. And initially a seed is nothing productive if I do not put anything into it. However, if I decide to plant the seed, then by my own action, by not affecting anyone else, I have created something that could be seen as productive. And our opponents would assert that because now there is a productive object that I may have claimed ownership over, that this is necessarily property of the community. However, this really seems baseless to me, at least. The burden of proof really lies on our opponents as to why something that does not take from anyone else is now property of the community. And also, we end up seeing a problem where the community is deciding for me what I can do with the things that I have. And one problem that arises from this is, how does a community come to decide what is supposedly best for the allocation of this apple tree that I've planted? And so far we haven't seen any kind of example of how a decision can be arrived on without coercion or government system being set in place. And so I would say that with the burden of proof lying on our opponents as to we would like to explore that.
Now Jack may begin with a 2-minute cross-examination.
So, what is your definition of ownership? How does someone own something?
Ownership stems from the non-aggression principle. The fact that if I own my own body, I can produce, and thus I can, work contractual obligations, work out contracts, and it stems from there, essentially.
It's basically a human construct. It's an idea, and it necessarily stems from a system where there isn't coercion. Basically, if everybody's exchanging with each other voluntarily, if the only human interactions are voluntary, then property is basically a side effect where then I can have exclusive claim over the things that I have on my person, the personal property, which we both kind of agree is a thing, and the exchanges that I've made with others voluntarily, and the changes to my environment that I've made in order to satisfy my wants and needs.
But you do claim that the most important thing is voluntary interaction and voluntary trade, right?
Absolutely.
And so any form of constrained choice then is an
No.
aberration
No,
from the NAP?
I understand where you're coming from, but that's not really true. Unfortunately, we're all humans. We are all subject to kind of an inherently difficult human condition where we're going to have to do things sometimes that we don't want to do in order to survive for as long as possible. And also there's the sad fact that eventually, for all of us, we're going to reach a point where is that my time? Okay. We're going to reach a point where our needs aren't going to be able to be satisfied, and we're going to die eventually. No matter what we do, these choices are going to be limited, and so you can't really say that there's some kind of injustice that nature is placing upon us. So if someone is not doing you direct harm, and exchanges are voluntary,
David,
then
we're going to have to move on. Sorry. And now, Gak, you can begin with your 3-minute body of your argument.
Okay. Capitalists derive profit by withholding value from their workers. Due to market competition, a factory owner cannot sell their goods at any higher than market price, which tends to equilibrate at production price, which is the amount of money that is spent producing them, on workers' wages, maintaining their assets, rents on land, etc. Most of these prices cannot really be adjusted. Wages, however, can be decreased because as long as workers do not have an alternative, they have to accept the wages the employer sets. So all profits derived off of selling at the production price are the differences between the value of what the workers produce and what they are paid. Historically, the state has indeed helped to maintain this relationship. Marx says the revolution brought into power the landlord and capitalist appropriators of surplus value. They inaugurated the new era by practicing on a colossal scale thefts of state lands. These estates were given away, sold at a ridiculous figure, or even annexed to private estates by direct seizures. Communal property, always distinct from the state property just dealt with, was an old institution. The systematic robbery of the communal lands helped, especially next to the theft of the state domains, to set free the agricultural population as proletarians for the manufacturing industry. The seizure Marx refers to is known as the Enclosure Acts. These were necessary for the foundation of capitalism in England, because without the enclosure, there would never have been a desperate population for the owners of capital to exploit. Before the Enclosure Act, the people had an alternative to wage labor in the form of the commons. Within the factory, the product of one's labor is promptly confiscated from them, and a wage, which is necessarily lower than the value of the labor performed, is paid. The capitalist rationalization for this is that no one would enter into wage labor if it were not beneficial to them. However, the threat of starvation or homelessness, a systematic violence committed against those who lack access to capital or productive lands, leaves the worker with no alternative to wage labor and a subservient relationship with the capitalist. Similar behavior to this occurs today. Lands are taken from the people and given to multinational corporations, much to the detriment of the indigenous peoples and the environment. These problems are exacerbated by the state but do not require one in order to manifest. These are problems inherent to capitalism. As long as the profit motive exists, the exploitation of workers occurs because all profits are deductions from the wages. Historically, workers will resist by organizing into unions over time. All work to lessen their exploitation, however, they cannot eradicate it without taking control of the factory itself. The demands of the union necessarily reduce the profits of the capitalist. The capitalist will then respond to this, often by seeking cheaper labor overseas. This exploitation of poverty, which we see today, does not require a state to happen. It is an inevitable result of market forces. This increasing exploitation would generally lead to an increase in resistance from the workers. And without an intervening force, this would lead to basically what we're talking about, which is worker control of the industry. But either the state or, in the case of their anarcho-capitalist society, a private security force, which would be entirely beholden to the capitalists, works to hold back workers' struggles and maintain private control of capital.
Now, y'all, you may begin with your 2-minute cross-examination.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to...
One second.
Can you guys hear all of us, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to approach is your view of exploitation. I think inherent in that is the belief that all things have an objective value. Would you say that?
I wouldn't say objective. It is created by human interactions. It doesn't exist in them prior to human relations with them.
Right, but essentially, once something is produced, it has a value.
Do you
That
want to answer that?
Sure, yeah. Once something is produced, it has a value. But how do you define value? What is a value?
well, let's for the sake of argument, let's say exchange value.
Sure.
Okay, so you would think that if say this, I don't know, this wallet, forget everything inside of it, it has a definite exchange value, and that someone who, if I think it's worth $5 and I'm selling it to you and you think it's worth $2, I couldn't agree. Would I be being exploited if I sold it for you for $2 if it's worth $5, and say that's the inherent value in it?
Well, if it's like either you get $2 from me or you starve tomorrow, then you're in a very exploitive condition. Yes.
The second point I'd like to look at is how you view the state in the relationship between, say, someone who holds the means of production and a proletariat, I suppose you'd say.
Well, historically, the state has been run by the people who own the means of production. And that, like, for our Marx example shows that the people who own the lands, the people who own the factories, have better lobbying capabilities. But even in a place absent state, which is what you're talking about, similar relationships would arise because the holders of the means of production still have an incentive to keep union power down, to keep workers from acting up, and to keep their means of production amongst themselves.
And the money to pay for production forces to do that.
Okay, thank you guys. We're going to move 5 minutes break before we do a repeat of this.
All right.
5 minutes. Go. we'll be beginning the debate again. Y'all will be beginning with another 3-minute body.
Is this the halfway point?
This is almost the halfway point.
Okay.
Not really, actually, at all.
I think it is though, because we've
You
done
want check?
bodies and then other things that the closing pretty much
Just,
balanced.
yeah,
My
go
time
through
is
it.
limited.
They're gonna do body, cross-examine. Then body, cross-examine, then each get 230 for reputations, and then questions from the audience.
All right.
Not really halfway. Begin.
Was it us?
Yeah. So, in case it for some reason didn't get across super clearly, the Collins example with the wallet was supposed to explain that there's no necessary subjective or objective value in any object, and so when a trade is made between two voluntarily agreeing people, both benefit from any trade when both agree, or else one person wouldn't get into that trade. And so what we've gathered from our opponents is that their theory of ownership isn't really grounded on any founding principle, but rather they're trying to assert that somebody owes others something simply because of the human condition or lack of alternatives. And they also say that even though two people may be agreeing on a trade, that trade is somehow exploitive. So I would ask our opponents, would they agree that this is an emotional appeal more than a grounded appeal? But there's also other holes that I'd like to ask about, and one big one is a big benefit of capitalism is the incentive for innovation. So I want to ask, what will provide the incentive for innovation and even like productive work altogether in a firm if the spoils of production are necessarily divvied up equally? Because I think that everyone would agree that they generally like to be rewarded or repaid in equal proportion to the added efforts that they put in or the greater good that they've provided for society, which is definitely indicated by, say, the added trade value that they've gotten between exchange, a voluntary exchange.
The anti-capitalist may now begin with a cross-examination.
Okay. So, what is your theory of ownership founded upon?
Once again, we derive ownership as a construct that arises necessarily from the non-aggression principle. Once again, if two people come together for a trade, it must be voluntary. And that means that if someone has mixed their labor with the environment without affecting anyone else, and for whatever reason they've, through their own ingenuity, have made that aspect of the environment particularly useful, they can lay claim to that which has come from their own ingenuity and labor. The reason being, it would take a non-agreed upon interaction in order to nullify that.
Why does someone need to necessarily own the means of production in order to take home the product of their labor?
Because
It's not necessary, but it is allowed. It cannot be necessarily.
So it's not necessary though. For,
I mean,
for
if you
people
want
to
to,
own-
you can
It
have
may-
a commune, or you can have a commune. You can have a factory that's owned by a union, it's owned by the workers, and could be completely democratic.
So long
But
as everybody agrees within.
and that's
this-
exploitation free, according to you guys.
Certainly,
That's right.
because everybody in this system agrees, and they can come
So then, at
together
what
and
point does owning the means of production become necessary to prevent exploitation? Is my question.
Well, as soon as the non-aggression principle is violated, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to see how there's no opt-out option for I don't know, an anarcho-communist. I don't want to mislabel you guys, but in a world where everybody owns the means of production.
and we call that coercive.
Sure. Alright.
Anti-capitalist, you may now begin with a 3-minute argument.
Sure. So, the anarcho-capitalists rely heavily on the non-aggression principle, hereafter referred to as NAP, which we do better. NAP is essentially a moral stance which asserts that aggression is inherently illegitimate, and we've talked a lot about exactly what NAP means. Before we even argue that we can NAP better, we should address just a fundamental issue with NAPs in general. First off, NAP is very simple. It is in fact too simple. NAP lacks nuance and specificity, being only a vague prohibition against aggression. A society which embraces NAP should oppose any and all forms of aggression, but the anarcho-capitalists do not have such oppositions to certain types of aggression. The real motive is the protection of private property, which is possible only through exceptions of the NAP. For example, say an individual is walking through an empty field and was clubbed over the head by another individual. Who is aggressing on whom in this case? Well, on first glance, it might seem that the person with a new concussion was aggressed upon. But what if the assailant owned the field through which our unconscious friend was walking? Then the anarcho-capitalists would argue that the aggression was justified, that the real aggressor was the person trespassing on private property, and our assailant was simply defending the exclusivity of their private property. This is the first caveat in their NAP. Aggression is justified and acceptable when used in defense of private property. As shown, this does not follow from the NAP, but contradicts it. The alleged right to protect private property is not derived from the NAP. It is a separate assumption that they hold and then insert into their understanding of the NAP in order to then excuse the defense of private property and any aggression that might result in. The only result of this exception for the defense of private property is the ability for the owner of capital to coerce and exploit others. Again, this is not freedom, but instead a deprivation of it. There are a lot of things we are not allowed to own because they are inherently exploitive. Without the aggressive enforcement of claims to private property, production could be undertaken by anyone. And then the fruits of their labor from that production would belong to that person. It wouldn't be taken away from them. We want the fruits of people's labor to go home with them. We just want the ability to produce being open for everybody. Private property, as established earlier, forces those without capital to produce for the capitalists in order to buy goods produced by themselves or other workers back from the capitalists. The lack of private ownership does not restrict freedom. The only option no longer available is that of exploitation. It's that of keeping people out of productive lands or productive factories. In fact, both the would-be capitalist or the would-be proletariat can produce within our system. Anyone can go into a factory and start producing in that factory or start tilling a field. The thing is, the people who are doing that now get to take home the product of their labor. It belongs to them as opposed to the capitalist post-production. And their example with the seed, they would plant the seed on communally owned farmland, but the tree that comes out would be theirs because they have repeated use and repeated personal use, which we said is personal property earlier. So your apples would be yours.
You may now begin with a 2-minute cross-examination.
Okay, I'll try to get these in reverse order. First of all, the first. Oh, this is a cross-exam. This isn't a response.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Got anything for me?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I'd like to point out that I'd like to ask how you guys feel about contractual obligation, and is it morally reprehensible or not?
Well, just like you're talking about, a contractual obligation without any external coercive forces is doable. That's fine.
Why? Why does a situation that a human is in, as a human being will always be put in a situation where they don't necessarily want to do something, but choose to do something because it benefits them? So why?
But
why is that inherently coercive?
If that situation is artificially created by a social system, I think we are right in criticizing.
Like artificial scarcity. There's no scarcity of productive farmlands. We produce more than enough food to feed everybody. That scarcity is maintained artificially through the capitalist system and through the private ownership of the means of production.
How do you respond to the idea that communities can come together in en masse to collectively bargain with their employers in order to receive a wage that they feel is fit for their input of labor?
Well, we talked about this already. Ideally, they would not receive a wage. They get to take home the fruits of their labor. But any reformation of the system in order to improve the workers' condition is something we would love to see.
But wouldn't that still be inherently exploitative?
Yes, it would.
But it would be
I
less
mean, we do support the right to seek a less exploitive situation within the current system. But the idea is that even if they have the right to bargain with their employer, they're still forced into that employer-employee relationship where they have no option because they do not own capital.
What if they choose to?
What if they
what if they want to?
What if they choose
I
to
want
be-
to be employed by someone, right?
Should we respond to that? I mean, it's not really a choice if your choice is be employed or starve because you don't have the opportunity to work under your own volition.
Yeah,
Why is
not
it
everyone has the choice, is what we're saying. And within our system, like you said, owning the means of production isn't necessary to reduce exploitation. And when people don't necessarily own the means of production, we see that there's less coercion and less aggression. So if we want to nap it up, then we should get rid of private property.
Okay. Now we're going to move on to your final 2-minute and 30-second refutation of the other side's argument. Y'all, you may begin.
All right. I'm going to address some of the points that were brought up in the last body and from our opponents. And one of that is the misrepresentation of the non-aggression principle. They had the example of a person walking on someone's land and getting their head clubbed over. The only problem is this same exact example could be brought up with personal property. If you see someone walking down the street wearing your shirt, are you justified in clubbing them down to get your shirt back? Well, there's certainly an initial aggression there. And there's definitely I see a soft opinion on what crime is and what even aggression on any kind of owned object is, regardless of whether it's a mean of production or personal property. And that's a problem when really the distinction between personal and means of production, any moral distinction, is really pretty arbitrary. And ultimately, there's hardly any object in existence that could not be interpreted as a mean of production. For example, a shirt that I have hanging on my dresser, right? It's useless to me hanging there, but I put my own labor into it to change it into something that's useful to me, that gives me satisfaction, namely a shirt that I'm wearing at that moment.
Or
So,
jacket.
yeah, or jacket. So, really, and even there are people that use themselves as a mean of production. There are people that use their own ingenuity to create, and their own thoughts to come up with a way to produce new things. And if we are claiming ownership over the direct manifestation of someone's thoughts, we're also actually claiming ownership over those thoughts themselves, because they're the cause of this increased possibility for mutual, I guess, prosperity. And when you claim ownership of someone's thoughts, that creates a
5 seconds.
very problematic situation. And this is a pretty specific thing. But yeah, I think that speaks to a lot of our opponents' philosophy.
And Jack, you can now finish up with your refutation.
So it's just really important to note that we do want people to go home with the products of their labor, but we're really strong in emphasizing that that doesn't happen in their system. And the reason it doesn't happen is because a worker will go to, let's say, the farm the worker works at, and they have to till the soil, and they work to till the soil. There's no manager. The owner of the soil isn't involved in this process. So the worker tills the whole field. The worker grows the crop, and the worker harvests it, but the worker does not go home with the fruits of their labor. So this is the problem that GAC sees. They've already conceded that there is no inherent need to own the means of production in a coercive free society. For some reason, it's just a good thing to have. We've argued, though, that the means of owning the means of production is inherently exploitive and aggressive. By keeping people away from the means of production, you necessarily make sure they can't use it. So if only a couple of families own all the farmlands, like only a couple of corporations own all the farmlands in America, then it's very difficult, or most of the farmlands in America, then it's very difficult for people to opt out of the system of wage labor into the agriculture industry. So there is a constriction of choice and a coercion that is made at that level. As far as the shirt becoming a means of production, I'm unsure how that happens. The shirt is your personal property, and if someone else takes that from you, then they're necessarily harming your quality of life by taking away something you need to survive. You don't need 100 acres of farmland to survive. You don't need a factory to survive. All you need is actually your labor, your willingness to work, and your shirt and your clothes.
I think the other justification is not just what you need to survive, it's what you use. You can use your shirt on a regular basis. You do that, you can make full use of that shirt by yourself. But you can't make full use of 100 acres of farmland by yourself. You need other people to work that with you, and you didn't produce the land in the first place. You don't, by yourself, produce the fruits of the farm that come from it. So there's no reason why you should be able to exclude other people from working that farm that you cannot work yourself.
But they mentioned at least once that we want to divvy up the production of people's labor, but that isn't true. As I've said time and time again, they can have their apples that they plant with their apple tree once it comes out of the ground. We just want to make sure that the land is available for everyone to be able to plant a tree in, because everyone deserves food security and everyone should have access to means of production.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to some questions. Okay, Tom. Go ahead.
So as you all know, and it's been mentioned in this debate, today is Earth Day. And oftentimes people will mention the fact that Brazil owns the Amazon rainforest, which is being cut down at something like 200 acres a second for Brazilian farmland. Unfortunately for Brazil, and this is just an example of the tragedy of the commons, I would like to propose this question to GAC. So, taking away all Brazilian politics, geopolitics, let's just say we have forest land that is key to the sustainability of our global climate system, such as the Amazon rainforest, and for that area. In what ways would you solve the problem of deforestation, and why, considering that if these lands were privately owned, people would have private control of the means of production as to them being cut down, and why would you support the Brazilian government just owning the land and just letting everybody take for it because it's everybody's?
We're also anti-status, so we don't support the Brazilian government really existing, let alone owning anything.
Yeah, we don't want the Brazilian government to own the forest. We want the communities within Brazil near the forest to own the forest amongst themselves. But one of the leading causes of deforestation, not just in Brazil and the Amazon rainforest there, but of tropical rainforests across the world, is globalization and the private ownership of capital. Corporations will go around buying up huge tracts of farmland in what's called, the new land grab or the new enclosure movement. They'll kick off most of the native farmers, and yeah, we actually have a lot of evidence right here talking about it, just in case we needed to. But the Bretton Woods Project, which is a watchdog for the WTO, talks about how there is a new land grab where the World Bank Group in the increasing acquisition of farmlands in the developing world by private investment. Well, I'll keep it short though. Basically, giant private corporations will buy up a huge bunch of farmland, kick off the indigenous farmers, and then set up monoculture farms for profit, for food exportation. And this is informed by markets as opposed to communal need. So a lot of the food that's produced there isn't food for the community. It gets exported elsewhere, which is also a big reason places where this happens have a lot of hunger, which includes Brazil and a lot of the developing world. And then they only hire back a fraction of the farmers who used to work that land, though, because they don't need to hire all of them. The rest of the farmers no longer have a paycheck, no longer have a way to farm for food, and no longer have access to getting money to buy food. So the only option left to them is either starve, which is not really an option for most people, or start cutting down those trees so you can plant something and survive. So I don't really begrudge them for cutting down trees because they're just trying to eke out a living, and they aren't the biggest player in the game. It's the private ownership of capital, which is exerted by these large private corporations, which force them coercively into that position.
May we respond to this?
Yes.
I think our opponents are making a false equivalence of capitalism to the state. Do corporations own their means of production? Absolutely. But in an anarcho-capitalist situation, a world, reality, this wouldn't be the case. In fact, we are not fans of corporations or super large businesses. And in fact, introducing a market is one way to cut down all of these big corporations because they sort of gain their power through the state and through real coercion, which is guns and jail and the electric chair.
Not the
and
human
taxes.
condition.
And taxes.
So do you don't support private police forces then?
No, well, we do.
But then that's them asserting their power through guns.
No, well, it's protect. I mean, if there's a violation of the NAP, but here we have. If I opt out of the state, what happens to me?
Police come and
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of the state either.
Right. Well, see, that's what we're against. I mean,
Well, if you opt out of the capitalist system, what happens to you? You starve.
no, you don't.
I mean, yes.
I mean, if you don't own
actually-
land,
no,
yes, you do.
Well, no, I mean,
that's not true because we've talked that people who want to survive are going to work, they're going to get employed, and they're going to
be forced into the capitalist system.
Wage labor.
They're not. A capitalist system isn't owned by anyone. A capitalist system is a system of exchanges between individuals. It's not anybody being forced into a system. It would be.
Okay, I think we should go move on to the next question.
Yeah, let's-
Keep it moving.
Thank you, both sides. Jerome Clark. All up to you, buddy.
Alright, so I heard half of this because I'm just trying to get it all in, but I don't really know what you guys are saying half the time. But okay, so as far as the Earth Day thing, and say if everyone owns the Earth equally, but someone really needed timber, for example, and they were they needed to chop down that tree to get the timber. Do they plant 2 trees instead, or is them chopping down that tree, which would that be an injustice on everyone else because they have now just taken away from everyone else's possible supply of tree?
Well, as far as resource management goes among communities, we're not necessarily saying everyone owns equal portions of the world. We're not going to take the surface area of the world divided by 9 billion and say this is your square. We just want communities to be in charge of the productive resources within their boundaries. So for example, a productive resource would be a forest for timber. And we actually have statistical evidence from specifically about forest land where communities, when they manage their forests themselves, they can feed themselves, they can provide for themselves without depleting the forest. But when corporations take control of similar land, the forests tend to be clear-cut, the communities are left without food security, and then it takes generations for the trees to grow back. And I mean, this is an issue with the profit motive as opposed to just with corporations. As long as communities can't decide for themselves how they want to manage their resources and other people are allowed to tell them that, things like this will continue to happen coercively.
First of all, I'd just like to commend you guys for having such fundamental differences and being willing to sit down at the table and talk to each other fairly civilly. I also appreciate the fact that there are at least a few students here, none of whom I believe has gotten extra credit or are required to be here for a class. So that's very impressive here at Gettysburg College. I'm trying to fight, I guess my desire as a role as a teacher to not strongly take one side or the other and let you guys sort of fight this out. So I guess I will sort of frame my question, one of my many questions or comments, in a way, I guess that it impacts both of you. The sort of irony, I think, is you both have this commitment to your own version of sort of a Lockean theory of property, that, you know, it's about mixing your labor, and that sort of determines your rightful claim, which is weird because then you guys combine that with this sort of subjective theory of exchange value. Usually Marx is sort of seen as a radical Lockean, as sort of saying, well, if labor creates all value, then the fact that labor doesn't get all value means that they are somehow being exploited. On the other hand, the Lockean theory of property also assumes this totally fictional state of nature where everyone sort of had an equal share, so to speak, of the free bounty of nature, and only could accumulate that which their labor could create. But your sort of primitive accumulation story points to the fact that the real world history of the emergence of private property, which historically is a very small fraction of human existence, whatever its benefits. I mean, flying in airplanes is even less, and I'm not trying to get rid of flying in airplanes, but these things aren't natural. They didn't emerge from some state of nature. But you know, that combined with the fact that the whole idea of mixing your labor as if our labors are somehow discrete. I mean, I've had Vishal in class, and I mixed my labor with him in class as I taught him. So now do I get my portion of his output when he goes out, you know, onto the job market? You know, these are all communal. Ultimately, we're sort of constantly mixing our labors that are not easily separable or distinguishable. Similarly, with knowledge and technology, we're drawing on a host of labors that came far before us that are part of our sort of communal patrimony, if you will. So I guess my sort of general point is that I find it odd that you're both, given your very different positions, are relying on this sort of antiquated theory of property, even though you sort of both implicitly recognize that property is a social construct and it should be judged in more of a consequentialist term. What are the results that it produces? And do we think that capitalism produces generally good results or generally bad results? So I guess that would be how I would have directed my comments if I were either of you. Sorry, that's a little long.
Go for it. What do you want to say?
I appreciate it. Yeah, there's a lot of really kind of deep philosophical, you know, small differences that can have really large implications, you know, once you take them to their logical conclusion. And I think a big difference is not just property, but also value. And we were trying to argue, you know, the best that we could, that exploitation can't necessarily happen unless you do have an objective idea of value. And yet, you know, a tiny, you know, just flipping that switch one way or another can, you know, can change our minds almost on.
Well, can you measure labor objectively? So for you guys, you can't measure value objectively, and therefore it's all sort of loosey-goosey, right? But you can measure labor in such a way, you know, that guarantees a very specific set of property rights.
Yeah, we could. You can measure labor by a number of different, I guess, scales. How much output, how far you're able to push the box, but people, you know, how many, you know, let's go back to the output. People are going to value my output of 10 apples wildly differently depending on the person and their needs and wants. And so, to really, I mean, one day you might have 100 people wanting all of the apples that I produced, and the next day the apples have no value because no one wants it. And so it's also it's not a constant value either. It's in a state of flux as people exchange.
Sure.
And
If I could add one quick thing, and then I'll shut up seriously. The irony there is that the demand, which determines value in your framework, is conditioned by the prior distribution of property rights, right? One can only effectively express a demand that can be backed up by, in fact, purchasing power. And the initial distribution of property, right? Different distributions of property will give rise to different demands and therefore different valuations in your system. So it sort of feels a bit circular.
Yeah, it's also kind of grounded in just human action, where I'm going to, you know, put my labor into a certain area, and I'm going to also put a certain amount of energy into protecting this output that I have to keep others from just taking it. And so they had better, you know, if someone wants my output, they better offer something that I'm willing to exchange for. And so I'd say it's also grounded in just the fact that humans act. They're going to make exchanges, and if those exchanges are voluntary, it means that both parties are getting more out of it than they're
better than they were
losing.
before.
Yeah, they're both benefiting.
Matt.
We were talking during the break, and you guys just said you were pro-unions, so I guess my question is, aren't those hierarchical, one, and two, aren't they inherently exploited because you have to pay union dues? A lot of professions, you pretty much have to join a union, otherwise you're not.
No, you absolutely, there are some that where you have to.
Well, there's sort of two things. What unions are today aren't what unions always have been or what they could be. Like the UAW and stuff, like, yeah, they're hierarchical. Yeah, it kind of sucks that you're forced to pay them, but I think at the end of the day, it's probably better to have them than not to have them, because I mean, we're still working with a capitalist system, so you're going to be exploited, and I think having someone who at least has to pretend to watch out for you is probably a good thing. But I mean, the UAW isn't exactly the best example of a union. Like, the union should be non-hierarchical, it should be democratic, it should be run by the people who it's representing. Unfortunately, that's often not the case. But in theory, a union should be made up of people who voluntarily join it and who all have an equal say in what it expresses for them.
And if I may, in an anarcho-capitalist system, unions, as long as they're free, completely voluntary, then it's fine. But, you know, like they said, what we have now is not like that, and it's incredibly distorted.
In the hoodie.
So you've been talking, both been talking about the non-aggression principle and the idea of how people shouldn't coerce other people, but isn't it unrealistic to given human nature and human tendencies towards greed, to expect people to actually behave that way? It seems to me that a society like that, where there was no coercion, wouldn't actually be possible, because inevitably the people who are selfish and morally corrupt, they're going to try to be aggressive towards or coerce other people for their own gain or benefit. So you need to use some sort of force to keep that in check. Doesn't it basically come down to the fact that we need the power of the state to protect people from other people's selfishness?
That's a great question.
That actually is a really good question.
You guys want to take this first?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
So, like I said before, great question, and what I think it's all about is it comes down to, while adhering to a moral standard, finding ways to balance out all of these people who choose to be, or who are morally corrupt, like you said. And essentially the way we work that out is a few ways. I guess the most direct would be having a private police force that would essentially, you'd agree to whatever contract, and they would uphold their bargain because there are other defense agencies, and so it'd be a market for police, and you get to choose what you want, and then there's another, and people wouldn't. I mean, this would keep people in balance because simply for self-preservation. I mean, I don't know if I'd attack you if I thought that there would be for your sweatshirt or whatever. If I thought that there would be someone else, or maybe even you, that could protect yourself.
And also, when we talked about the non-aggression principle. We kind of skirted past one point, which is that basically it's unjust to initiate force against someone else. But once someone aggresses against you, it kind of follows that you are justified in meeting that force with force. But the initial I guess initiation of force against you, that's what we are looking at as the initial unjust act.
As a threat.
And that's a threat like that. And there needs to be a practical solution, because there are going to be people who break the non-aggression principle. And so that's where Colin's explanation came in, with a possibility of private defense firms, and how we deal with it now is just the monopolistic police force. We just wanted to open that up to a market personally.
Okay, so there's a few things I'd like to address here. One, I just want to point out that we don't actually claim the NAP as our moral basis. We think it's sort of vague, contradictory, and not really well substantiated. We were just sort of pointing out the contradictions in their stance. Well, first, human nature is a really vague, nebulous concept that doesn't really mean anything, because, I mean, regardless of whether we accept that there is one, it's very obviously very heavily conditioned by upbringing, society, and a million other factors. I mean, if you look back at sort of indigenous tribes, they were generally fairly egalitarian and not particularly greed-centric. This focus on greed is a product of our society, at least to some extent. I'm not saying humans have no innate ability to be greedy, but this complete centering on greed is very much a product of our society. So as for the risk of someone being greedy and aggressive, basically instituting a monopolistic state which protects class power to prevent oppression is instituting one form of oppression so that we don't have to worry about fighting another one in the future. It's instituting it as a permanent factor rather than just something that we might have to deal with in the future. There's no reason why a community can't defend itself against an individual or a group who wishes to impose their will on the community. I don't see why we necessarily need state authority for that to happen.
And just to go off what he said, historically, there for a vast amount of time, European society was also very anti-greed. There were accumulation of wealth, accumulation of things was not seen as a good thing, and so accumulation and the drive towards accumulation is a fairly modern phenomena. So the focus on greed is a product of culture.
Well, moral values. I'm not saying societies don't have moral opposition to greed, but the fact is, even if a society can have moral values.
I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to move on to another question.
Okay.
Wait, before we get another question, do you want to get pizza first? And then
Yeah, there's also pizza in the back for anyone that wants to get it as well. 2 minutes for pizza. Then we'll
Had a burger.
Alright. The next question will come from Burger Pants.
Yeah. Gentlemen, well done.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your discussion. Look forward to more events in the future. Okay. Right. Professor John. We're at the anarchist, libertarian. All right, see you.
Bye.
Bye.
The Shaw.
I'm sorry, guys.
Hey, I think you guys
That's fine.
what you see as a problem. Today's problem.
It's about power.
But it's also about capitalism.
And the private ownership of capital and the accumulation thereof is the source of plutocracy.
I don't want to give you a privilege, like 4 minutes.
I mean,
Because I mean, you just oppose
See,
plutocracy.
this is the thing. It's like I don't like it.
You were like talking about stuff, and you're just like, so
Well, here's a very straight
So,
is my, you know, with the
what is your skill?
I mean, there's state-initiated programs that we have, implemented,
do you think it's a successful program?
I'm not saying that there can't be things
I
that
mean,
change,
like
but my question is the sense that community run, whether you want to call it state or just,
You guys both in the system.
group, organization, group. How do you,
Just think about it.
Well, okay.
or the EPA, I mean, I just use that as an example.
Alright, well, as I talked about earlier, communities when they're managing their own resources and land tend to do much better job than corporations in maintaining the natural integrity
Also,
of
what's
their
your position
environment.
about communities? I mean, I can argue that the state's a community, on the other
It's really
side,
big.
but
Usually when people talk about community, it's like the people who are next to them. And
It often strikes me as basis.
yeah, so it's more like within. I mean, we have geographical areas.
but that kind of goes on to the question, in the sense that I feel like, communism, right, or working on this, all working about how to keep this. And once you start engaging in a free market, free trade society, which I'm sure unfortunately you want to do in communities, you start having some modern society where you want to call it a state or not, it's your own opinion. But I feel like at some level, I'm fluctuating my free market system. We had to stay in the
First off,
a couple things to address.
So first off, as far as again regarding your governmental agencies, especially the EPA,
Like in this.
if you look at crimes that are committed in the United States, you'll find there usually like 3 or 4 categories.
yeah, this
Categories: victimless crimes, drug use, underage alcohol consumption. The other crimes that are directly related to property, theft of material needs to the state. And then there's crime that is done
Let's stand up now.
for the explicit material gain of excess capital, so white collar crime.
I mean, those differentiations don't matter. I'm asking how we establish.
It's a little bit. And then finally you have crime that is crime, murders. Okay.
Guys, we're gonna move back to just the last few questions. If the respective sides wouldn't mind jumping back to the tables.
I mean, that's a pretty broad claim. I mean, I don't think you can really.
You wouldn't have to
Okay,
steal
hey,
bread.
Can we put a time limit on questions in the interest of all of our time?
Yeah,
Finals are coming up.
yeah,
During holiday.
How many more?
just a couple. It's kind of arbitrary.
Alright.
If it's
I've got a question.
If it's an interesting point, we're not going to cut them off. And if you want to leave, you're free to leave.
Okay.
No,
My time is my time of property.
No coercion.
Gurkha Pants, go ahead.
I'll be brief. So given that you're both anti-statist, and that this, like, whether you are advocating a non-capitalist system or an anarcho-capitalist system, these are attainable and desirable. Like, how does one go about, like, bringing?
No state. How does one go about bringing no state?
Or your respective system.
Well, it's not by voting Republican.
Or Democrat.
Okay. Oh, you want to do this one first?
Yeah, we'll do this one first. As far as, well, I mean, Ian and I might have different views, so you could go right after me. But as far as bringing about the downfall of the state, I feel like the best way to do it is to co-opt the state's main uses right now. So communities should organize together and find out how best to address food insecurity. Make community gardens, allow people to go places to plant food and better themselves. Communities should come together and figure out how to solve healthcare issues. And if communities can do these themselves, then the government becomes less and less important. It's every single act of personal liberation from the state where individuals can come together with their community in order to co-opt the functions that the state does is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly agree, like, just the idea of basically sort of solving problems without the state or capitalism. Also, as far as, like, we discussed unions, like, instead of, like, joining, like, business unions like the UAW and stuff, like revolutionary unions like the IWW are a good way to sort of start building sort of a collective solidarity that moves in that direction.
But yeah, make the state irrelevant. That's our tactic.
Yeah. So there are two main ways of thinking about it, and in the anarcho-capitalist school of thought. The one that I subscribe to, it's similar to theirs, and a guy wrote about it. His name is Samuel Edward Konkin III, and he basically said economic secession is the key to getting rid of the state, making it irrelevant, and essentially that entails engaging in all things counter-economic, and that is selling and buying things on the black market, participating in anything that will get you away from the state. Not paying taxes is also another one.
So no like little Marxist Leninist guerrillas with AK-47s?
No.
I mean, there probably would be violence necessary at some level, but not the primary.
But we just were talking about guns. Okay.
Oh, so much to address. Well, first of all, I want you to finish up what we original question was, but real fast, I mean, I don't really know how much you really side with Marx or stuff, but from an anarcho-capitalist perspective, someone of the communal values that you kind of advocate for, I think that the student observer of philosophy would, in your case, would support Marxist ideas. What surprises me is what the position you take on how to eradicate the government, in the sense that Marx consistently advocates for radical support of this capitalist society. No unions, no social programs. Arm the public, because you make them as miserable and as well armed as possible, because then you have these people who will rise up and take over in a communal sense. And that's advocated from the Communist Manifesto. It surprised me that you would support this more of a pragmatic sense, more of a pragmatic democracy, in the sense that you want the communities to come together to co-opt government programs. But that's the point. My question to you is continuing with what I originally said, which is the sense that which is what I originally said, which is that how would I keep saying communist society, but whatever your society is, how would you address state-based programs that I think are somewhat necessary, like the Criminal Justice Department, for an example? But I mean just a wide range of anything from like the EPA to the Criminal Justice Department. I mean, I know how y'all would address that, but
just really quick, we're like anarcho-communist, libertarian socialist. You can be a communist without agreeing with everything Marx says.
No, I know. I just didn't know. Like,
yeah, we take his like
you advocate
analysis of capitalism
so
is generally good, but his political program is not so good.
All right, I mean that's fine. I just do advocate for a multiplicity of his programs. So
I mean, as for how we would address these things, I mean, I would like to point out that there is precedent for what we're talking about. It has happened.
Successfully?
Yes. 20 years and running in Chiapas, Mexico.
I mean, I'm well aware of that, but continue.
There's that. There was the
That's another debate.
Free Territory in the Ukraine from like 1916 to 1919.
Yeah.
Catalonia and Aragon in Maine from.
See, I mean, here's what I specifically said to you before.
If you wouldn't mind letting the guy finish.
All right. Just real quickly. I mean, those cities, those small communities coming together are applicable, but on a larger scale.
Chiapas is a whole state, so we can talk just really briefly about Chiapas, and I feel like this will answer your question very well. Within Chiapas, Mexico, the Zapatistas, which are a radical communistic group, have taken over control of the land and the governance. They patrol their perimeters and defend themselves with volunteer militias, and they share all the means of production, they grow food communally, and they do all these great communist things. But the Chiapas is a really big place. They have like something like 12 to 18 villages, or like districts which have multiple villages in them. But they found a way, and they've managed a way to organize themselves with direct democracy, bottom-up control, in ways where they're accounting for things like criminal behavior, they're preserving the environment, they're maintaining law and order, all through community action, community cooperation, direct democracy. And I could get into the specific systems, but it would take a long time. So if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it later. But there is precedent for these kinds of things happening. It's not like it's a shot in the dark. We just need to be ready to trust each other and ourselves with our futures.
And now we have just the moderator question, I guess. My question is to Gak. In your system, it seems that you have to subscribe to the system, or else I don't even know what would happen to you. But the reason I subscribe to the opposing side is that there's the ability to have your system voluntarily, yet also this system. And as you just said, the Zapatista rebels have the ability to operate outside of the system. So why could you not have the overarching anarcho-capitalist society, yet with a smaller subsect of anarcho-communist commune of some sort within it?
Well, there's a few things. Like as we've shown, like the basis of capitalism is the removal of communal lands. Like that was the original basis of capitalism. It continues to be necessary. Yes, but also on a broader scale around the world in different ways. But that's sort of necessary as the basis of capitalism. As for the Zapatistas, they are constantly harassed by paramilitary and military groups, so it's not like they're just allowed to operate outside of the system. They have to fight for it every day. But the problem with saying anarcho-communism could exist within an anarcho-capitalist society is you don't actually have the opportunity to freely remove yourself from the capitalist system because you need to buy land. So if you don't buy land, you can't become an anarcho-communist in an anarcho-capitalist society, because you don't have the means to sustain yourself, because they're all owned by the capitalists. As for in our system, it's really important to note that there is no one system. Like however people want to organize together to produce, to distribute what they produce, to solve like community problems, like they're free to do that. There is no one relationship set up for them to enter into.
And the only overarching requirement is that the means of production, not necessarily the goods that come out of the means of production, but the means of production themselves are communally available. So if you guys really want to plant a bunch of apple trees and be apple merchants, you can do that. That's doable. And you can ride around in your apple carts and do that all day. But no one is stopping you. The only prohibition is fencing off farmland you are not actively using and saying, well, this is all mine as well. Anything anyone grows in it is also mine as well, and this will always be this way because of my private police force. That is something we have issue with, because that's all farmland you're not actively using. You can never use 100 acres of farmland yourself. So a lot of people go in and work on that. A lot of people should be able to take the fruits of their labor out and keep it with themselves.
I guess the other perspective on the same question is that strangely I tend to agree with a lot of the things that you said. If you're not using a certain plot of land that you somehow just claimed as yours just because, it doesn't make it yours. You have to actually mix your labor with it in order for it to be yours. And if it's a spot of land that from someone else's perspective you're not using, but you do have it fenced off and have put effort into keeping it exclusive, then that is, I mean, it's having that land is deriving some value, and you've put labor into protecting that land. So we would call that mixing your labor with it.
It was abandoned, and now it's yours.
Yeah. And there's definitely room for abandoning land and other people claiming it in our system. You can't just decide I own every source of the Mississippi and it'd be yours. And I think that we would not overestimate the power of a landowner to buy up all the land and it being in so few hands. It's easy to do that Like when we see this corporatist system that we're in now, but when there's really truly competition in all markets, I think you would see a lot more of an egalitarian outcome than what we have now, even though because of where we live, it might seem unintuitive.
Okay, so it's mixing the labor with the land that makes it yours, right?
Yes.
So if you hire someone to mix their labor with the land becomes theirs.
How are you paying them? With your labor, with your money that was produced through your labor.
I just have a question about the fence. Does that mean the best and quickest fence layers in America will own everything? I mean, I just feel like I'm in the wrong profession. I'm good at fences.
Well, if it's a crappy fence, then it will not be a fence at all. It has to be actually a legitimate...
Like the one around Gladfelter.
Yeah, just like...
All right.
You know how many Snapchats I see from the top? I think...
Alright, we're going to have to cut it now. Kind of arbitrarily. 8:32, so it's over. We'd like to thank everybody for coming, especially considering I know nobody was getting extra credit. Also, go home, read some Rothbard, go read some Chomsky. Applause for our debaters. They were excellent.